We are speaking with Bentley Christie from the Compost Guy blog about how to start composting. This week on the Greener Business Podcast. Why should we start composting?
Why start composting? There's a lot of reasons, obviously, on my end, it seems pretty obvious to me as far as why anybody should start composting. Environmentally, there are a number of reasons that it's certainly beneficial. I've read that I think somewhere in the range of 20 to 40% of your typical waste stream that ends up in the landfill can be organic waste. And I think that number can actually be up as high as 50 or 60% in some areas. Obviously, if you can reduce that amount of waste that ends up in the landfill, that in itself is a pretty beneficial thing. But for me, I think about it probably more in terms of the benefits for the actual person who's setting up the compost bin. Compost is absolutely a phenomenal soil builder. Sort of adds slow release nutrients to the soil, and it's great for the overall soil structure and overall health. Compost can boost not only nutrition in the soil but also disease fighting ability of the soil, which is obviously beneficial. And it gets you away from the sort of traditional agricultural method, just in terms of using inorganic fertilizers and pesticides and these sorts of things. So it's a very organic type of approach. Anybody that's sort of interested in heading more in a healthy direction, both for themselves or for the soil, is probably, I think it's a great way to go.
How do we start composting?
Well, really, when it comes down to it, there are there's probably a number of things you need, but obviously you need something to compost with. You need some sort of material, a starting material. And you also need moisture is very important when it comes to composting, and oxygen. These are sort of the materials that you will sort of mix together to actually start a compost heap. You don't really need anything as far as the structure goes. A lot of people have it in their head that they need to run out and buy the most expensive compost tumbler or, expensive composting unit to put in their backyard. And, when it comes down to any sort of a heap of organic waste is generally over time going to become some form of compost. Now, obviously, there's ways to optimize the situation. The choice of materials is definitely an important consideration. And when it comes down to it, it's carbon and nitrogen are the two major elements. Not to try to complicate matters here, but those are everybody thinks of it in terms of carbon to nitrogen ratio, or C to N ratio. So you definitely want materials that are carbon rich along with materials that are nitrogen rich. So things like the leaves, those would definitely be an example of a carbon rich material. Whereas as green waste like grass clippings or fresh yard waste, these sorts of things would be considered nitrogen rich. And generally speaking, again, not trying to complicate matters here, but typically a range of between 21 and 40 to 1 of carbon to nitrogen ratio is generally what you're shooting for. But really, when it comes down to it, if you mix some nitrogen-rich material with some carbon-rich material and have more of the carbon-rich material, you're probably pretty much good to go. Like it's not really rocket science when it comes down to it.
What is worm composting?
Worm composting is, I guess it's similar in that it's a breakdown of organic waste. But obviously, the main difference is, of course, that you're using a special type of worms. And the one thing that people often get confused with is this whole idea of using earthworms. They assume that any species of earthworm will work for worm composting, but it does actually have to be a certain type of worms, composting worms that are specialized for living in these sorts of habitats. So red wiggler worms is pretty much the most widely used type of composting worm, and those are the ones that I have used for the most part. Aside from the worms, the big difference with sort of traditional backyard composting, or hot composting, I guess, and vermicomposting is that once you get past the idea of sort of raising these worms, which isn't very difficult, they're very, very easy to manage animals. It doesn't take a whole lot to keep a worm bin, essentially. But once you get past the worms, basically the actual process itself is much more forgiving, I find. You don't need as strict a carbon to nitrogen ratio, although you generally will want to try to balance things somewhat. But it's not quite as exact a science. The worms do a lot of the work for you. Some of the benefits, you don't need to turn your pile. The worms sort of move the materials around, and the same with sort of aerating. Oxygen is a very important part of composting, as mentioned, and the action of the worms moving through the composting mass helps to aerate the pile. And generally, it can be done on a much smaller scale. So somebody who lives in an apartment or a condo, somewhere that you don't have your backyard composter, worm composting is definitely an excellent choice. But as far as getting a hold of worms, there are a huge number of online vendors that sell worms that you can easily order from. It's not a bad idea to try to find somebody in your local area. Or these particular types of worms are pretty hardy creatures, but still, you want to limit the amount of distance that they have to travel. It's just sort of reduce the stress on them. And I mean, if you maybe talk to a local gardening club or a local waste management organization, and they would certainly know. So it's definitely not too difficult. And generally, they cost about $20 to $30 a pound, which sounds like quite a bit, but they reproduce very readily, so that if you can keep that initial stock alive, you'll have a lot more worms on your hand in no time.
What are other composting methods?
Well, one other, there's a variety. Composting is a very general term that a lot of people throw around, and it does get used for a wide range of different types of waste management, essentially. The traditional hot composting is one option. Vermicomposting, of course, is another option. And one that I've sort of gotten into recently is called bokashi. And it's actually an anaerobic process. It doesn't require oxygen. And it's really actually quite cool. I kept an open mind with it, but I thought I'd try it out. And it's extremely easy. You just put together a bucket, and you have this material, a bokashi material that you can actually buy or make yourself. And essentially all you do is you throw your kitchen scraps and your organic waste just into this bucket, and basically add this mixture every time you throw it in the bucket, and just keep it under your sink, keep it wherever. I thought for sure it was going to have an awful stench to it, but it actually smells quite good. And it's a very easy way to handle your waste. And if you happen to have worms, you can actually feed this material once you let it brew for a couple of weeks. You can feed it to your worms, and they seem to love it. Or if you have a backyard garden, you can bury it in the garden, and it provides, again, excellent nutrition for your garden soil. So it's just something to keep in mind. There's just a few different options out there as far as composting goes, and they're very, very straightforward and very easy to get started.
How did you become Compost Guy?
My interest in compost probably developed a good 10 years ago or so, and it really literally all started with a worm bin. A coworker of mine actually had a worm bin in the office that we happened to work in at the time, and I just sort of fell in love with it. She'd basically take her food scraps from lunch, and she'd just throw them into this bin every day, and they turn it into this beautiful soil. So she was a very nice lady, and she shared some of her worms with me, and that's sort of basically how it all started. And yeah, basically from there it just sort of blossomed out into all areas of composting. Again, vermicomposting is my main passion.
What are your websites?
Well, as mentioned, there's compostguy.com, which is sort of my feature site, I guess. This is sort of me. Basically, the things that I'm interested in, gardening. I talked very recently about aquaponics, which is sort of like hydroponics and aquaculture combined. Redwormcomposting.com is my site that's actually dedicated to the topic of worm composting. I have a site called Eco Sherpa as well, which is I started with a friend, and that's even more general, much more of a just sort of a green living, sustainable living blog.
For more information about this podcast, visit greenerbusinessshow.org and contact us at contact@greenerbusinessshow.org.